There is a country on this planet where you can drive for an entire day and never see another human being. Not a village, not a fence line, not a single light glowing on the horizon after dark. Just wind, grass, and a silence so complete it starts to feel like its own kind of sound. And somewhere inside that emptiness, buried in reddish cliffs that most travelers will never even hear of, lies the exact patch of ground where scientists once dug up something that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about the beginning of life on this planet. I am going to take you to that exact spot before this video ends, but not yet, because to understand why it matters, you first need to understand the land that managed to hide it for tens of millions of years without a single soul noticing. And if strange, forgotten, almost mythical corners of the world are your kind of obsession, this channel is built entirely around finding them, so it is worth sticking around for what comes next. This is Mongolia, and calling it empty barely does justice to how much is actually packed into that emptiness. Just over 2 people occupy every square kilometer here, one of the lowest population densities found anywhere on the globe, roughly the same handful of neighbors you would expect scattered across an area the size of a small nation. Strip that number down further and it only gets stranger. Nearly half of every Mongolian alive today is packed into the capital, a city that physically covers less than 1/3 of 1% of the entire country's land, meaning almost every square kilometer beyond it holds almost no one at all. Everyone else, every herder, every child chasing a horse across open grass, every family living beneath canvas and felt, is scattered across a landscape so enormous it swallows them whole without leaving a single trace behind. That landscape is the steppe, one of the last truly intact grasslands left untouched anywhere on Earth, boxed in by mountain ranges tall enough to choke off the rain long before it ever reaches the open plains below. The result is not gentle, and it never pretends to be. Winters here plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius, dragged in on knife-edged winds pouring straight down from Siberia, cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Summers flip that completely, spiking past 38 degrees with almost nothing falling from the sky to cool any of it down, turning the same ground that froze solid months earlier into cracked, sun-baked earth. Almost none of this soil can support farming. And to the south, a cold, expanding desert is quietly swallowing more usable land with every passing year, inching further into territory that families have grazed for generations. This is a landscape built to punish carelessness, and yet somehow, people have thrived here for thousands of years anyway. But here is the part that should not make sense yet, so file it away for now. It is exactly this cruelty, this refusal to be kind, that forged one of the most resilient and enduring ways of life humanity has ever produced. Because roughly 800 years ago, rising out of this same unforgiving ground, one man built the largest connected land empire the world has ever known, 24 million square kilometers stretching from the doorstep of Europe deep into the heart of Asia, ruled through a mix of brutal military discipline and surprisingly advanced organization for its time. His name still shapes almost everything here, from street names to festivals to the enormous statues watching silently over the capital. And somewhere in this story, something he supposedly discovered buried in this very landscape is said to be what set that entire empire into motion in the first place. Hold on to that detail. It matters a great deal later. But this is not just a story about the past, because roughly a third of Mongolians today are still living almost exactly the way their ancestors did centuries ago, following their herds across open ground and sleeping inside round felt tents called jurs, structures that fold down completely and travel with the family, now quietly wired with solar panels bolted onto a design that has barely changed in generations. There are more horses roaming across this country than there are people living in it, and children here are commonly riding confidently before they can even walk in a straight line on their own 2 feet. That bond between people and horses explodes into full view every July during the Naadam Festival, a celebration built around 3 so-called manly games: wrestling, archery, and long-distance horse racing. Wrestlers grapple in flowing traditional dress while crowds roar around them. Archers draw bows crafted the same way they have been for centuries, and riders as young as 5 tear across 30 kilometers of open steppe at full gallop. The training behind all of it is passed down almost unchanged from the exact warriors who once rode for that ancient empire, kept battle-ready generation after generation, even now, even with no actual battle waiting at the end of the ride anymore. And the culture only grows stranger the deeper you look. In the forested north, a tiny community known as the Tsatan build their entire existence around reindeer, relying on them for transportation, food, and clothing, in one of the last places left on the planet where that particular way of life still survives at all, largely untouched by the modern world pressing in around it. Far to the west, Kazakh nomads still train golden eagles by hand to hunt alongside them, capturing wild eagles young and raising them for years before eventually releasing them back into the wild. An art passed down in near total silence from parent to child across generations, with barely a written word anywhere to explain how it actually works. Spiritually, Tibetan Buddhism runs through almost everything here, shaping temples, festivals, and the daily rhythm of entire towns. But underneath that surface, something far older is still quietly alive and breathing, and we are coming back to exactly that a little later on. First, though, a secret tucked into the Western Mountains. And I have to be honest with you about this one, because most videos will not tell you the truth here. There is a lake up there so impossibly clear that you can watch mineral-rich patterns swirl and pulse beneath its turquoise surface, driven by underground springs that make the entire lake genuinely seem to breathe, rippling gently even on days with no wind at all. Not far from it sits a second lake, this one soaked in deep, burning red, its surface reflecting, shifting skies and glowing almost like fire once the sun drops low behind it, framed by rolling hills and wide open plains that stretch out in every direction. Both are staggering to look at, and both, honestly, are not technically inside Mongolia at all. One sits just across the Russian border. The other lies inside Chinese Inner Mongolia. But the culture bleeding across both of those lines is so ancient and so deeply shared that calling them honorary Mongolian wonders feels more than fair. Everything from this point forward, though, is entirely, unmistakably, 100% inside the country itself. Scattered across that endless open steppe, you will occasionally catch small bursts of color interrupting the muted grassland. Reds, blues, greens, and yellows painted boldly across rooftops, visible from miles away, especially once winter berries everything else beneath a blanket of white. Each home sits alone inside its own fenced plot of land, a layout inherited almost directly from nomadic camps, where open space once meant room for livestock to graze and for entire communities to gather. It is a small architectural detail, easy to miss, but it quietly reveals just how deeply movement and open space remain wired into this culture, even now, even in places where families have finally chosen to settle down for good. Not everyone lives out on the open steppe, though. Tucked into a river valley sits the capital, a strange and genuinely fascinating collision between centuries. Monks still chant inside a working monastery here, its curved rooftops sitting almost in the literal shadow of glass towers rising just behind them, incense drifting between ancient wood and modern steel. A national museum and a carefully preserved winter palace both hold relics tracing the country's entire turbulent history, from imperial glory to Soviet-era collapse to the fragile rebirth that followed it. Climb the hill overlooking the whole city, and you will find a Soviet-era memorial, its faded murals frozen mid-tribute to a wartime alliance from a very different political century entirely, offering sweeping views across the valley below that make the climb worth it on their own. But nothing in this city compares to what waits in its central square, renamed decades ago after the empire's founder. A towering statue of him now stands guard before the state palace, generals flanking both of his sides in stone, and high on a nearby hillside, an enormous carved portrait of his face watches silently over everything unfolding below. This is a country that never once stopped honoring the man who built it from nothing. And this is where that earlier mystery finally begins to unravel. 54 kilometers outside the capital stands the largest equestrian statue on the entire planet, a gleaming 40-meter-tall figure of the empire's founder mounted on horseback, built entirely from raw, weather-resistant stainless steel. It was placed at this exact location for a very specific reason. Legend claims this is the precise ground where he discovered a golden whip lying in the grass, and that single discovery is said to be what finally pushed him toward the conquests that eventually built his empire. Climb up through the horse's head itself and you reach a viewing platform staring straight out across the same open steppe he supposedly once rode across himself. Nearby, a second statue quietly honors his mother, the woman whose strength and guidance shaped him long before any of this ever existed. From there, the mystery only deepens further. Near a small town sits a massive boulder covered in inscriptions carved across countless centuries, ancient scripts and personal messages layered one on top of another, tied to a legend claiming a hero once used the rock itself to physically seal away an underground monster. Pilgrims still travel out to touch it, hoping to draw on whatever energy is supposedly locked inside. Deep inside a national park, Another sacred rock formation stands where locals still quietly leave offerings, genuinely convinced that the spirits of the land are watching over them from somewhere inside the stone. And when the sun finally goes down, some of them still gather for shamanic ceremonies, drums pounding steadily, chanting rising into the darkness, symbolic objects passed hand to hand, reaching out toward ancestors in a tradition far older than Buddhism itself ever was here. The monasteries scattered across this landscape carry that exact same weight of history, built by devoted hands and later scarred by politics, and not all of it is gentle. One 17th century complex once held over 1,000 monks before communist purges in the 1930s tore violently through it, leaving behind only ruins that are only now, slowly, coming back to life through prayer and patient restoration. Another, founded in the 1580s near the ruins of the old imperial capital, once held 108 separate stupas, blending Mongolian, Tibetan, and Chinese design into something that exists almost nowhere else on Earth. It too was badly damaged. It too has been carefully rebuilt, standing today as both a living, functioning monastery and a museum preserving everything that managed to survive. Surrounding that monastery lies a valley recognized by the entire world as one of humanity's most important cultural landscapes, a crossroads where wave after wave of nomadic civilization once passed through and left something behind. Stone memorials dating back to the 8th century honor forgotten leaders whose names have mostly faded from memory. Carved deer stones planted over 3,000 years ago mark burial grounds nobody fully understands even now. Herding families still live here exactly as their ancestors did centuries earlier, and a waterfall drops 20 meters through the open plain nearby, one of the quietest, most breathtaking corners of the entire country, largely untouched by anyone outside it. Push further west from there, and the land rises sharply into jagged mountains, straddling 3 separate countries at once, climbing all the way to a peak over 4,000 meters tall that leaves even experienced climbers completely speechless. These mountains are not empty either. Tuvan communities and other small ethnic groups have called this remote corner home for generations, adding yet another thread to the country's already tangled cultural mosaic. Thousands of Bronze Age carvings are etched into exposed rock faces here, protected today as a World Heritage Site of enormous importance, quietly documenting hunts and rituals from thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. Snow leopards still stalk these slopes in near total secrecy, alongside wild ibex and rare mountain sheep, all circling glacial lakes tucked quietly between the ridgelines above, fed by winding rivers that carve through valley after valley of untouched wilderness. And then, finally, the desert. One of the most iconic stretches of land on the entire planet. The Gobi rolls out in endless dunes, jagged rock formations, and colors that genuinely should not exist naturally in a place this dry. This desert holds its secrets close, revealing them only to those willing to actually venture into its heart rather than skirt around the edges. One granite formation rises straight out of the desert floor like an abandoned fortress, dramatic and weathered, said to have once sheltered fleeing Buddhist monks inside its hollows during times of persecution. And then, glowing deep red at sunset, the cliffs where absolutely everything changes. This is the exact place. In the 1920s, paleontologists digging carefully into these blood-colored cliffs uncovered something no one had ever found before anywhere on Earth: the very first dinosaur eggs ever discovered by modern science, sitting inside rock that had quietly protected them for tens of millions of years. That golden whip legend from the statue outside the Capitol, and this genuine scientific discovery buried deep in the desert, both trace back to the exact same unbroken thread. A country whose ground has been silently guarding its biggest secrets the entire time, patiently waiting for someone curious enough to look closely and actually find them. Just beyond those cliffs, one final formation waits, a limestone structure so pale and strange it looks almost otherworldly, rising out of the desert floor like something out of a dream rather than something carved slowly by wind and time. Its layered pinks, whites, and burning oranges catching fire in the setting sun like the crumbling walls of a temple built by nature itself rather than by human hands, casting long shadows across the sand as the light finally fades. It is the very last stop on this journey, and somehow, standing there in that fading light, it still manages to feel exactly like the beginning of another one entirely. That is Mongolia, a country most people could point to on a map and still know almost nothing real about, quietly hiding some of the most extraordinary landscapes, legends, and scientific discoveries found anywhere on the entire planet, tucked behind an emptiness that hides far more than it ever lets on. If this pulled you in, tell me down in the comments which part of this vast, unforgettable country you would want to stand in with your own eyes first, and go check out the next hidden world waiting for you right after this one.